Hey, I'm Dave Fisher. Welcome back. We're going to be going through John chapter 18 today. Just a little bit lighter chapter. That's actually a truthful statement, but it'll be fun. We'll get into it here. I always like to start with the goal of John the Gospel. It was stated in chapter 20 here. These things are written that you can believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So John, is more evident here, has just lots of information about Jesus. And he has all these stories and he has all these events. And he doesn't tell you every single thing, right? He's with Jesus for 3 years-ish. Who knows the details? But there's a lot of stories. And so he picks out certain things to tell you. And he uses these events to tell you a message that he thinks is most important for you to know. And we're going to see that in chapter 18 here because the synoptics cover this time period really well. And so we're going to see that John add certain things and omit certain things, and it's going to be really interesting to see why he's writing what he's writing. He says that with the rest of the sentence, so that you can believe that he's Messiah, the Son of God. By believing, you can have life in his name. And so that's kind of the goal here. Chapter 18, we're in a whole new world. So 13 through 17 were this very detailed, spirally working around a key point message by Jesus to his disciples. It was deep, right? And so with 18, we finally come up with air. It's narrative again. So there's physical things that are happening. People are interacting. And these events are going to leverage John telling us a story of things that he wants us to know. So we're going to see in 18 is the arrest and trials. We're going to blitz through some trials. 19 is the conclusion of the trials, just with Pilate. Crucifixion, he'll be in the tomb at the end of 19. And then 20 is going to be the resurrection. That's going to be a lot of fun. And then 21 is a different section for the epilogue. And so when you come into 18, there's probably a lot of things you're expecting. But I'm going to, spoiler alert, kind of tell you some of the main points that John wants you to know. We'll get into these in a little bit. And the reason I'm doing this early is not to spoil it, but just to tell you that I felt like in 13 through 17, it was deep, right? You had to focus. And this one's a little lighter because some of the messages Jesus is Yahweh. I have accepted this for a very long time. So I accept that Yahweh created the world. I accept that Jesus is distinct from and is Yahweh both at the same time. He reveals Yahweh to us. And I've been there for a long time. So we're going to see some divine claims here. We're going to see that Jesus is a king, an inverted king, kind of a flipped around king. That makes a lot of sense. I've accepted that. So not a king the way we think of kings, but he's a true king that will be a king one day. Jesus came to testify to the truth. This is something I've accepted for a long time. Chapter 6 talks about this fun ways with Peter acknowledging it. Little messages about you shouldn't stand outside. You should sit at the table with Jesus, kind of the idea. And then the main point of 18 is coming from Peter. So he's going to really focus on Peter in chapter 18 here. But I thought Peter himself captured it best in 1 Peter to always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope you have. So this always be prepared to give an answer is a lesson that Peter learned. And we see where he learned it. He learned it right here in John chapter 18. And then this last part is really important, so I'll say it. Do this with gentleness and respect. So this is an important message for us to really focus on the last part, so I thought I'd repeat it. So that's going to be the main point. You're going to get it. And so really it's a light chapter just to kind of have a little fun with and to see some of these connections that John put in for us to see. Lengthwise, we're right towards the end here. So 18 is largely trials, 19 is cross, 20 is resurrection. Chapter lengths all slightly smaller. If you didn't know how John worked, you would probably be expecting at this point a lot of details about the video camera footage. What would you have seen if you were standing there? Because I was. You'd learn details about Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, how the disciples fell asleep 3 times, and how when the arrest came, it was Judas and the 30 pieces of silver, and the ear actually is in John as well. You would expect to see a trial with Caiaphas where he tears his clothes and they talk about destroying the temple in 3 days. None of that is in John. Peter's 3 denial will be. There were actually 6 trials. So like if you try to harmonize the Gospels, you can see that there's a trial in front of Annas, which is only mentioned in John, a trial in front of Caiaphas, a trial in front of all the Sanhedrin, all the council members, it says. Then they go to Pilate. Pilate sends him to Herod. Herod goes back to Pilate. John does not get bogged down with any of that. He just has a message he's trying to tell. If you wanted to get a background information before you come into John chapter 18, I'd recommend it. You could read all the gospel accounts. So it's here. It's like Mark starts in chapter 14, Matthew starts in chapter 26, Luke starts in chapter 22. And so basically, if you just read from that marker to the end, you would see the story told 3 times. John assumes you know all of that. They've been out for 30 plus years. People memorized it by now, for crying out loud, right? And so he's going to tell the story because he has a responsibility to tell the story of Jesus' death. He can't just tell the story of Jesus and leave out the death. But he's going to focus on slightly different details, and we're going to see his point is to always be ready to give an answer, right? And that's actually the point. So he's going to hit Peter's denial big time, and he's going to hit the trial with Pilate pretty hard because it's going to be kind of like the showing of the king. But he's going to completely omit the trial with Caiaphas, the trial with Herod, the prayer in Gethsemane. They're just not going to be there, right? Because he has a different kind of agenda. I do think it's helpful if we're going to not watch those backgrounds to kind of get an idea of spatial locations. I am a spatial thinker, and so this helps me just to kind of keep the story in my head before we dive in. So I just wanted to talk about some places. So this is kind of a simplified map of Jerusalem. It shows like Herod's palace, which is where Pilate would have been living now. The Hasmonean palace, which is where like Herod Antipas would have been, perhaps other Herods as well. Their guess at where the upper room was, I think the guest upper room, who really knows? Could have been anywhere in the lower city, right? The temple, the Garden of Gethsemane, the path that Jesus probably walked to go into the temple, and then out the gate that who would have known to get to the Garden of Gethsemane. He could have walked many ways, but just it seems like he might have said goodbye to the temple on his way to the garden. We also see, I'll point out this on this map, chapter 18, if you've looked at it at all, it says they crossed the Kidron Valley. And so the Kidron Valley is this valley that's on the east side of Jerusalem. There was not the greatest valley. There were some like bodies in here. It's kind of used as a cemetery at times. You had to be careful when you went through there. It wasn't a great place, right? By the way, the other valley, the Valley of Hinnom, the Gnome Valley, this area became synonymous with the word hell, right? So not a great valley either. Got that name largely from during the time period in the Old Testament, the worship to Molech, they would burn children in this area. So if you were to go visit today, which I wouldn't recommend right now, you can descend the steps into hell, which is literally the Valley of Gnome. So they're on the other side. They crossed over the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. John, by the way, never mentions that it's Gethsemane. He just calls it the garden, right? So the thing that's important to John is the garden, but not really the other. Lots of different maps online. This is kind of the same map. Probably the Last Supper was in the poor district, the lower city, as opposed to the upper district. Maybe it was in the upper district. I mean, some places put it right here in the upper district, saying it was a nicer area, but we don't really know. And it also doesn't matter, right? But that's a fun little map. I thought I would use this one just because I think it looks cool. It's like a 3D rendering of first century Jerusalem. It's neat because even if you went there today, you wouldn't get this view, right? So this is a view you only get through digital technologies. So if the Last Supper was in the poor district, Jesus and the disciples would have gone to the garden this way, to the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas would have probably headed to, we don't really know. I'm using my imagination for fun here. Would have probably headed to the high priest to collect the Jewish officials to kind of kick this thing off. Very much planned. This is the last day before the festival starts. So the festival is going to start with Passover and then go for a solid 7 days. So very much planned that they want to be at Pilate's first thing in the morning, right? So when the sun comes up, they're planning to be at Pilate's doorstep. Judas would have gone to collect the Jewish officials first. and then they would have gone to collect the Roman soldiers. So John tells us that there was a cohort of Roman soldiers. A cohort could be as many as 600. Most historians think the word there means 1/3 of a cohort, which would have been 200, a mandible of soldiers. But I mean, 200 Roman soldiers is force, right? So they're coming into the woods, right? They're planning a search party. They've got their lanterns, they've got their torches. If it was a time period where they had dogs, they'd be coming into the woods with dogs, right? Like they're prepared if needed for a fight. Is really what it is. So Judas, the Jewish officials, and maybe 200 Roman soldiers, they crossed the bridge. By the way, they built a special bridge over the Kidron Valley because it was not a good place. I don't know the history well enough, but presumably they would have taken that route to get over to the garden. And so that's where we find ourselves when we come into to chapter 18. Some things you might also want to know. This is kind of the guess as to where Pilate's residence would have been. That was probably right. That's Herod's palace. And then where the Herods, because there's more than one Herod, they're all named after Herod the Great. Antipas, Herod Antipas, Archelaus, if he was still alive, I can't remember, would have been there as well. Cool. And so things that would have happened, they would have arrested Jesus and carried him off. Judas probably went his own way. It talks about in Matthew how he went into the temple and threw the money back into the temple, the 30 pieces of silver. Surely some soldiers would have gone back to the barracks at Antonia Fortress. But some, of course, would have made sure to see him handed over to the high priest. Maybe it was just the Jewish officials at that point. But they would have gone to the house of the high priest, which is where both Caiaphas and Annas would have lived. They would have both lived there. We'll talk about those two guys here in a little bit. Peter followed at a distance. I mean, he probably didn't go over that bridge, right? He wasn't allowed to take the same route that they would have, but he would have been able to kind of keep them in his eyesight as he saw where they were going. Peter, by the way, clearly not asked by Jesus to do this. He's just thinking, I've got to protect Jesus, and this is how he's going to do it. His heart's in the right place, but you've got to follow by listening, not by following by doing what you want. Other things is like when they would have brought him to Pilate first thing in the morning, probably a fairly short trip. Pilate to Herod, Herod back to Pilate, probably pretty short trips. And then to the cross, Golgotha, later that day, right? I like these maps because they're fun. I won't show more maps. I just wanted to put up a couple just to show that they are all a little bit different. And so this is based on science. Science changes as more facts come around. The next thing you should probably do is you should stop listening to me and go just watch it. Here's a link with some Lumo video camera footage that they thought. I think it's good to see the video camera footage to think about what happened, but don't stop there, right? So, by the way, this picture of Jerusalem is just really cool 3D rendering of what they think it might look like. I just think that's neat to still from the video there that you can click on. But really what you should do is you should see the message that John gave you by reading it. Some tools that I'll mention to help you read. We've talked about the Literal Word app. There's this Greek Hebrew Interlinear Bible. Lots of these great resources. I wanted to talk about, and we might show it today some, Blue Letter Bible. It's a really, really complete one. It's not quite as intuitive as some of the others, but it's kind of got the most information if you're willing to dig and find it. It's both an app on iOS and Android, and then it's also a website. In this video, I'll probably use the website some, but it's kind of like the mega app that has lots of good information. So if you wanted to get good with it, it'll help your studies. All right, so we'll go ahead and dive in. There's going to be some keywords we're going to see. One of the first ones is this Ego Eimi statement. Ego Eimi is how the Septuagint translated the name that we pronounce as Yahweh, or I am. So usually it's, what is that? An Aleph, Hey, Yod, Hey. So Yahweh. That doesn't seem right. Something seems wrong about that. I feel like I highlighted the wrong thing there, but that's okay. Moving on. Let's go ahead and dive into the worksheet. So the worksheet, there's a link in the slides, not until slide 29. I'm just going to go back and forth between the slides and that handout. The handout has the actual text, so I'll just kind of go back and forth between them periodically. So this handout, it starts with an overview of how this chapter works. It can be really useful to look at the literary design of these chapters so you can see what the author is trying to communicate to you. This chapter has a very clear chiastic structure. Chiastic structure just means there's symmetry across the middle. So for example, Peter, his denial is broken up into two halves, which are split by some meanwhile at the high priest things. He says, I am not one time in both of these, and he denies it 3 times total, but says I am not only one. So very clear connection there. The outside is, I am Yahweh at the top, and then the bottom, I am a king, right, is kind of what these two are structuring. And then the middle is, in this version, part of the trial at Annas, which is only mentioned in John. And in the middle, he is talking about how he's not doing things in secret. So like Peter is doing things in secret. And he's speaking openly and bearing witness. And he says, question those who have heard me, like Peter, for example, right? And so that's actually the point John is making in this chapter, is that you need to be ready to be in places where you should be and be ready to openly confess who Jesus is, right? And so that's the message that John's really going for. You would think that it would just be about the trials and these details, but it's not, if you look at the way it's set up. And so Jesus always bears witness to the truth, and that's what we should do, because everyone who is on the side of truth hears his voice, right? You can also see there's a frame in this chapter. This happens in a lot of John's chapters. It starts with the question of, who do you want? And so it's, we want Jesus of Nazareth, right? And then it ends with Pilate asking the people, who do you want? And they choose Barabbas. I've said this many times that I really feel strongly that John himself, the authors of John, wrote chapters because this division here is so weird, because he's in the middle of Pilate's trial when this chapter gets cut off. But if you go looking, it's actually not weird at all, because you see frames like this and you see this over and over and over again. So really neat structure. The time that the authors spent on this, John and the people that helped him after John, just really, really interesting. I put it in Greek for you. We'll come back to this Greek. I made it page 2 here. This is modernized Greek with like accent marks and spaces and commas and periods and all that. The original was probably all capital letters, and so you don't have to look too much into the details. Let's go ahead and just dive in. So you can compare John 18 to some of these other chunks in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's kind of this first section about the arrest in Gethsemane. So I'll read it some with you. So when he'd finished praying, he crossed the Kidron Valley to the garden. Doesn't say Gethsemane, just says garden. Garden activates a whole bunch of images and ideas. The Garden of Eden is the idea here. So Genesis 2:8, the Lord God planted a garden in the east in Eden. Eden means delight. And so he and the disciples went into the garden. So kind of like the first Adam here. And then Judas, who betrayed him, he knew the place because Jesus often met there. So Jesus wasn't hiding. This is not a top secret hideout to avoid getting caught. He went to the plainest place he always went. Wasn't hard to find. So Judas went there guiding a detachment of soldiers. So the word here could mean 200 soldiers. John's the only one who says there were Roman soldiers present. Some officials from the chief priests. So that's kind of like the local police officers. It's like you've got like the military carrying M16s, and then you've got the local police guys from the Jewish officials. And then also a couple of Pharisees that were along with them, carrying 3 things, carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Both a significant overestimate of what's going to be needed. They could have sent just one person, right? But also an underestimate if there really had been like a Jesus fight coming down here, right? Knowing all that was going to happen, he went out and asked them, who do you want? This, by the way, is very similar to John chapter 1. There's a lot of connections back to John chapter 1 here. It's almost like somebody planned this. So turning around, he saw them following, and he asked, "What do you want?" So this was to the two disciples. I think it was Andrew and the other disciple, who was probably John. And he said, "What do you want?" And this is, "Who do you want?" But it's the same question. So this question that they planted, this is the first words Jesus says in the Gospel of John, comes back up here. They say, "Jesus the Nazarene," and he responds, "Ego Eimi." And it mentions quite awkwardly that Judas was standing there with them. Just kind of jam that in there. And so when Jesus had said, "Ego Eimi," they drew back and fell to the ground. This ego eimi, it's the closest equivalent to the word Yahweh that we've got in Greek. And he says it twice. I always wonder if it was once in Greek, once in Aramaic, or what the deal is. It's kind of an interesting word. It's actually worth taking some time and studying. We did an activity in our group today. We looked through every use of ego eimi in in John, which was kind of neat. So ego eimi, the two words, ego means I and eimi means am. I found 24 of them in John. You have to look at the Greek, because if you look at the English, there's a bunch of I ams that are not ego eimis, right? So I found 24 of them. There might be a couple more. I might have missed a few, but 24 was a good number to go with. And what we did, this is the Greek, and then here's the English, which will make more sense to us. We went through and we tried to identify each one as being either a divine claim, so like I am Yahweh, or being something that tells who Jesus is, like I am the whatever, I am the bread of life, I am the way and the truth and life, things like this. I always enjoy the Bible Project poster. I'll just bring it up here. So they mark, the 7 I am statements. I am the, and then the 7 I am statements. To be honest, we love to make sevens, but it's kind of hard to say for sure if there's clearly 7 or not. So what we did as a group is we just decided to try to prove it. So we took the 24 and we decided to say, hey, how many of these are, divine claims, ego eimi, divine claims, and how many are, I am the statements. And then how many repeats are there of each one? It was a fun little activity. Just to point out some of the ones that we found that were neat. 9 is an interesting one because it's said by somebody else. It's said by the blind man who's born blind. He says, I am the man. So that's clearly not a divine claim. But it's an important thing because at this time, like, Jesus is sending him out. So it's that guy is saying, I am, kind of like how Jesus says, I am. And they don't believe him, right? There's quite a few that are parsed pretty easy. I am the bread of life. I am the bread. I am the bread. I am the living bread. The bread that came down from heaven. So, these 4 kind of all go into the first I am the statement. I am the light. This one was the hardest one to categorize for us. 8:18. You'll see that Bible Project just ignores it because it's kind of hard to categorize. But he says, I am a witness for myself, and my other witness is the Father who sent me. It's really what it says. So what do you do with that? I am a witness, not necessarily even the witness, but I am a witness, and my Father is the other witness. So clearly Jesus is calling himself the Father, but we don't want to put it in this category because I am the witness would make 8, so we don't want to put it there. We don't really want to make it a divine claim, so we just kind of ignore that one because it makes our numbers off. But just kind of interesting to go through. I am fine with their assessment. So 7 divine claims. You have to rule out some of these because it's a repeat. Jesus didn't say it; somebody else said it, and here he's just repeating what he'd already said. So these kind of go with that one. But at any rate, it's a fun activity to do. I think I've been too long on that slide. So after you're done with that game, these divine claims, you can keep on reading. And so it happens again. Who do you want? Jesus the Nazarene. I told you I am he. I told you ego eimi. If you're looking for me, let these men go. So this is an important thing. Steps up to protect the other people, right? So that's definitely one of the points that John's trying to make here. He even says so. This happened so that the words spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost even one of those you gave me. He actually says in other places, except for the one doomed to destruction. He said that in 17:12. The one in 17:12 is a reference back to 6:39 as well, that he should lose none, but of course he lost Judas. So Simon Peter drew a sword. Gospel of John is the only one that names Simon Peter here, but he is the one who drew it and struck the high priest. In Luke, it says that Jesus healed this ear. In John, it says that it was his right ear, and the guy's name was Malchus. Right? All these details that make it ring of like a first-hand account. So John feels like he's just kind of adding in some details that you may not know from the other things. In the other Gospels, he says, put your sword away because those who live by the sword die by the sword. Here he says, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? So drink the cup is an expression for like, if life gives you lemons, make lemonades. If you've got a job to do, if you've got work assigned to you, your role, your like plate in life is the cup that's been given to you. So Jesus, his role here is to reveal God. And so if my role is to reveal God, why would you not let me drink this cup, right? And so dying on the cross is the way he's going here. That drink the cup comes from, it's kind of like a displacement of the Garden of Gethsemane. So John didn't tell the Garden of Gethsemane, but there's two places where he takes language from Jesus' prayer there. So here and also in chapter 12, it talks about this same thing. You can go find chapter 12 if you want. And so they bound him. This word bound is an interesting one. So bound, it means, put handcuffs on him. Like I get that. But it also means like to prepare for death. So it's used 4 times in John. With Lazarus, who was bound with the wrappings, and then they said to unbind him. And then here they shackle him, so twice in 18. And then when Jesus is dead, he's bound. So I think that the message John is really trying to say here is that this is no trial, right? They've already bound him. He's prepared for burial. So the trial, if you wanted a trial, you're going to have to go back to chapter 5, right? So chapter 5 had the trial. We're way past that here. Cool, so kind of a neat thing. And so they sent him to Annas, just to tell this story. Annas was a high priest years ago, from 6 to 10, AD, so a very long time ago. But he's still alive. And so Jewish law, you're a high priest until you die. But Romans would appoint a new one even while the old one was still living, which that made people mad. And then you've also got this Game of Thrones situation for who's the real high priest with power. And so Annas, I almost think about it as like Annas is kind of like the reigning monarch who has no real power, but he's kind of the ceremonial high priest because he's the one who, based on the Old Testament, would have been high priest. And then Caiaphas is the acknowledged by Rome high priest. And he was actually a high priest for many years. It wasn't necessarily I think he did 15 years. So he'd been high priest for 12 years and was going to serve at least 3 more after this. And so he'd been around for a little while. After him, it does every year there's a new one after him. So kind of reading on. So that first part, Jesus is Yahweh. Got it. Jesus protects those that he's been given. Got it. So kind of lighter. We get to Peter's first denial. So Peter was following along. It says this in all the Gospels. And then the other disciple, who's unnamed, were following Jesus. And that disciple was known to the high priest, which that's really interesting because it only says this phrase, the other disciple, a couple times in John. 21 will say it, and there it's clearly identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved, who wrote this book. So it kind of is suggesting that this other disciple is the one who wrote this book, who I've simplified and just called John, because that's what we believe it is from the forefathers. So it's kind of interesting that he was a fisherman in Galilee, but also known by the high priest. That seems a little far-fetched, but it's certainly possible. Some people have suggested that on his mother's side, because his father Zebedee owned fishing fleet in Galilee. He was an important person. If the main thing is fishing and you're on a fishing fleet, you're probably a wealthy individual in Galilee. So son of a wealthy man, just happens to be a fisherman. His mother is at the cross, so his mother, it wouldn't shock me at all if his mother's side was a bunch of priests, because John always talks about water, which is kind of a priestly thing to do. So at any rate, knew the high priest. Probably, since he's the one who mentioned Annas, he probably knew the Annas side of the high priesthood. So that's probably why he mentioned Annas, right? Whereas other people didn't care about Annas. At any rate, Peter had to stand outside. So Peter was outside the door. Lots of little symbolism with standing outside the door. The other disciple spoke to the servant girl on duty. So definitely not the temple, definitely just the house of the high priest here. Details like the fact that it was a girl that was on duty. She asked him if you're one of his disciples, and he says, I'm not. Right? So this is always be ready to give an answer, Peter. This is a lesson that Peter learned. The Greek was Ego Eimi, so it's more literally, am not. And it was cold, and so he was standing with them. So Judas was standing with them, and now Peter is standing with them. Peter, of course, thinks he's here to protect Jesus, which you got to admire, but that is not, your heart's in the right place, but you're not doing what you've been told to do, right? They scene break. We're going to come right back to Peter later, but for this chiastic structure, and we go inside the house. So meanwhile, so these little transition, meanwhile, they question Jesus, and he says, something that explains the outsides, right? So this is the fun with chiastic structures. So he's always spoken openly. He's always taught in the synagogues or the temple where everybody comes together. It said that in John 7, by the way. Here he is speaking publicly, and they're not saying a word to him, right? Why question me? Question those who heard me, like Peter, for example. Surely they know what I said, or they'll deny me. And the priest officials slapped him in the face. And if I said something wrong, then testify to what's wrong. So again, this martyreo comes up. This came up in throughout John. Witness. If I spoke the truth, why'd you slap me? And he said him bound to Caiaphas. And so still very much no trials happening here, just going bound from one place to another. You can read this thing. There's a neat little comparison to this story and Paul in Acts. So Paul is also in front of a high priest, a different high priest, Ananias, very similar name to Annas. And he's slapped and he gets mad. You whitewashed wall. You can read it. Paul has to back off, right? So Paul's like, oh, I didn't realize he was the high priest. Yeah, right. It says it's written, don't speak evil about the ruler of your people, right? So Paul has to kind of apologize. Jesus doesn't, right? Jesus has nothing to apologize for. So the inside informs the outside. The outside, you know just what's coming. Simon Peter still standing there with them. Yep, so little chiastic structure there. Warming himself. Yep, warming himself. And so we pick right back up. You aren't one of his disciples too, are you? You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you? That sounded familiar. He denied it, saying, I am not. I am not. So this time they use the word denied instead of replied. Interesting, this time he uses this ox ego, which it's funny that this one was ox eimi. So combined you get an ego eimi. All these little nuggets. And then somebody identifies him who was probably there. Didn't I see you with him at the garden? So connecting back to the garden very clearly. And he denied it again. So this word denied pops up twice here. We'll look at that in the slides in a minute. And then the rooster began to crow. I'm assuming you know this story well, but here's the text from John 13 that kind of explains this is all predicted. It's also fun because this marks sunrise, right? So we know it's time to go to Pilate. This word denied is fun. It goes back, there's only a few of them in John. Let's see if I can find that one. There's the bound one. I already talked about that. Here's the one I was looking for. Denied is a word that only shows up 4 times in John, so really not all that often. You will deny me 3 times. That one's probably expected. He denied it and he denied it. So it's only used these 4 times. The other one is interesting because it's used in chapter 1, all these chapter 1 connections. He confessed and did not deny, but he confessed, I am not the Christ. This is John the Baptist. It's also fun to go look at the word. So this word deny is what connected us here. And then sure enough, there's an ego eimi in here. So ego eimi. And so this is the word that Peter uses whenever he says I am not, right? So I not am. So many fun little connections. But clearly a connection to chapter 1 there. All right. So again, these are like fun connections. There's no deep religious significance to these things. It's just fun connections. So it's just what makes this chapter so light and pleasant, right? After that, so we're kind of finished the core of the chiastic structure. The only thing we've got is the big finish about kings and kingdoms. The big finish, by the way, is going to have the word king and kingdom. It's basically a very similar word in Greek. You can see how many letters are shared here. It's going to come up 7 times because that's how we roll. We like 7s. Speaking of liking 7s, here's an ego eimi, ego eimi, ego eimi. So the first one has kind of like these 3 ego eimis. The middle is repeating what Jesus said. There's 2 Peters, I am not, with an uk eimi and then an uk ego. And then in this next section, sure enough, Pilate's going to say number 6, I am not a Jew, am I? So he says, I, ego, am eimi, and then he sticks the word Jew in here in the middle, so I am not a Jew, am I? And then Jesus will get the final number 7, I am, in reverse. This is so funny. So it says, I am a king. Technically it says, you say that I am a king, but it's inverted. If you didn't realize that Jesus was an inverted king already, maybe John's Greek here will tell you. He puts it, speaks it like, you're a king, am I? And so it's a inverted king there. That's just funny. Other things we're going to get to later, just want to get to. When Pilate comes out and says, do you want the king of the Jews? And they say, no, we don't want him. We want the Barabbas. And so we can put definite articles, the, in front of personal names, but honestly, John doesn't. You can see all these marks of Peter. By the way, there's exactly 7 Peters, and then there's 3 Simons. It's kind of fun how that. We'll talk about this later, but it really kind of suggests that it's like the Barabbas, which means it's more like a title. So you have to know what Barabbas means when we get to that. We'll save that until we get to that section. So looking at things here, we've got the final chunk with Pilate. They take him from Caiaphas to the palace. Wait a minute. We skipped the entire Caiaphas trials. There were 2 that we just kind of skipped there. Yep, we skipped them. We just didn't even say no tearing of the clothes, no destroy this temple, raise it in 3 days. Skipped it all, right? So this wasn't even in there. I love it. Doesn't Annas and Caiaphas, they never say a word. The only thing that happens is he gets slapped, right? So John gives them no voice, no respect for what they're doing here. It was early morning. That makes sense. The rooster just crowed. They want to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, so they can't go into a Gentile's home, which, like, you've just got to pause and appreciate how funny that is. So simultaneously killing God and wanting to be outwardly clean. So yeah, that speaks for itself. Matthew phrased it well whenever he was quoting, you blind guides who strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Pilate is now on the scenes. He comes out and says, what charges are you bringing? You can see they don't get along because they don't answer. They just say, if he weren't a criminal, we would not have brought him to you. You can see what their relationship was like there, right? So we don't want you to judge. We want you to swing an axe, right? We want Jesus crucified. It's shameful. It's humiliating. That's what we want to do. We want him dead. By the way, they couldn't kill people. There was a law where they could stone Gentiles that went into the temple, but otherwise they couldn't kill people. And so the only way they're going to kill him is with Pilate's permission. And if they were to kill him, they would stone him, right? But they want him killed the Roman way. Pilate says, hey, you don't want my help. You don't want me to be the judge. You take him yourself. Judge him by your own laws. fine, do it yourself. And he does do this, by the way. Luke tells us that he sent him to Herod, right? So sent him away. Learned that he was a Galilean, shipped him off to Herod. We skip over that in John. We have no right to execute anyone, and this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. So he says numerous places early. This one I grabbed from chapter 3. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, which is a fun reference, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. And so lifted up on a cross, lifted up, symbolically as well, so that those who believe can have eternal life in his name. So this is just before John 3:16, right? So then Pilate went back inside, and apparently Jesus was inside. That's the problem that happens with compressions. It's like the story reads funny. Like, at what point did Jesus get inside? But that's because we're the second trial of Pilate at this point, right? And so he at some point has figured out that he's calling himself a king, and anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. And so he asked Jesus, are you a king? So this is our first of the 7 kings. Is that your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? So it's like a legitimate question almost, right? Pilate doesn't really respond very well. He uses his own I am. Am I a Jew? Which of course means I'm not. They sent you over to me. You're kind of already in a humiliated state here. Jesus, very bold still. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. So he was originally asked, are you the king of the Jews? And so he says, my kingdom is not of this world. It doesn't say in this world, it says of this world. So it doesn't respond the way that this world responds to kingdom. So it's not a kingdom the way you think of kingdoms. If it were, by the way, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. Doesn't mention the Roman soldiers, just Jewish leaders. And so Peter actually did fight, and Jesus immediately told him, stop, right? So very clear that's not how my kingdom works. My kingdom is from another place. By the way, it does say kingdom 3 times in the Greek, but here it just says it in the NIV. Hearing this, Pilate's like, ooh, I've got something. Pilate's whole goal is to get himself out of trouble, right? And you are a king then. That actually makes it exciting because we can crucify you, which is what they want, and we'll be all good. And Jesus says, you say that I am a king. This is the inverted king am I statement. But in fact, I would have phrased it differently. I was born. I was came into being. This goes back to the prologue of John. I came into this world, so the Word became flesh and dwelled among us, to testify to the truth. So I would say it's, king is secondary. Yeah, I am a king, that's true, but that's not really the point. I came to reveal God, right? And everyone on the side of truth listens to me. So if there was a main point of this chapter in what Jesus is saying, that's going to be the one, testifying to the truth. Pilate, what is truth? So funny. And then he went out again, they're gathered there, said, I find no basis for a charge against him. So Pilate does not want to do this. He knows that it's not something that he wants to do. He's just trying to get out. Comes up with a plan here, tries to send him away. That plan doesn't work, tries with another plan. We have a custom to release people at Passover. Historically, this custom did exist. They would release somebody of the Jews. It was another form of control. It was a way of showing their power by releasing like their top generals back to them, right? Because nothing you're going to do is any bearing on Rome. Like, so we're that far above you, right? And so he was hoping to get the crowd to go against the leadership and say, hey, do you want the king of the Jews? They were prepared for this. Nobody got caught off guard by Pilate. Clear what Pilate was trying to do. But they said, no, give us the Barabbas. The king of the Jews, the Barabbas. Barabbas is a super fun name. I was waiting to get to this one. It actually means, where is it at? It's down here. It's the bottom half of the slide. Bar is Aramaic for son. Hebrew, it's the word ben, but in Aramaic, bar would have sounded just like son. Ab is the word for father. Just A-B is all you really need. Abba is a little bit more complete. All we need is the ab. And then the as, names, when they went into Greek, they would add like an os or a us to the end. So like that's why we actually get the us in Jesus. So you can drop the us. Judas is really Jude, which is Judah. So you can drop that. So this guy's name was Barab. And it would have sounded to everyone like son of the father, right? So I mean, it's kind of like we have names like Aaron's son, right? And so you can hear when you hear it, that last name came from somebody whose son, it was Aaron's son, right? Like David Arid's son, right? They would have heard it as well. So a bunch of names had Barnabas, Barabbas, Bartholomew, son of this other person, right? Ab means father. Abraham, Ab, father. We get that connection right away. And so really what they're saying here, it's actually almost best in the Greek. So it says down here, the son of, and then I can't read the Greek. Should have saw that coming. The son of the rebel, right? And so we translate, of course, that Barabbas was the rebel, but you could also translate it as a title, the son of the rebel, right? Which is another fun way, the son of the father, the rebel, which is just a fun way to look at it. And so we see that we're actually in a new century, but we're playing the same old game, right? So I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed. So this is like the devil's seed, so the seed of the snake, Barabah, and her seed. So they choose the seed of the snake is what this name means. And John sees and knows the meaning of this name, so he kind of highlights it with this word the in there. A little bit of stretch, but it's kind of neat and fun to think about what John might have been thinking. So he will crush your head. We see pretty clearly that this is Jesus. You shall bruise him on the heel. Jesus, by the way, in chapter 8 said, you belong to your father, the devil. You want to carry out your father's desires. And so this is the son of the father of the rebel. So just kind of fun. All right, so I went into that in great gory detail. Some other things that I chatted about with the group is just kind of some reviewing. The first names that we saw in chapter 1, just kind of looking all back there, was the Lamb of God. Keep in mind what day this is, right? So this is the day before Passover. All the Passover lambs are currently living. They are going to be killed here in a couple of hours at the same time as Jesus, and then they're going to be served up for the Passover meal, right? That's what Passover is. So called the Lamb of God, very clear with the dates that are picked here. A lot about you must testify. So this idea of standing in the right place and bearing witness. This is our role, our model of discipleship. Lots of references to the king. And so we see the use of the king here. There's also other uses of king. By the way, here's the other uses of robber. The ones who came before me were thieves and robbers, and the robber comes in another way. So those are the usages of John. Here's the other usage of king. This is the last slide I'll show. So we see this king of Israel introduced in chapter 1, a couple other king references, and then really driven home here in chapter 18. All right, so that's all for this week. It's pretty clear what's coming next week. We're going to do the rest of Pilate's trial. And Jesus is going to be on the cross and then in the tomb in the garden shortly after that. So we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us for John chapter 18. A little bit lighter, a little bit fun, and definitely focused on kind of slightly different things because of who John was. All right, see ya.